I went to the University of Michigan because I originally was going to be a historian, but the University of Michigan at the time had a very good practical master's degree program in journalism, which no longer exists, which a lot of well-known journalists had gone through, and I elected to go through that and never had any regrets. I regret that the university doesn't have the program anymore, but I was very happy with my degree.
Where did you live?
Well, I wasn't a typical student. I had recently gotten married. I did have a dorm room, which I seldom ever used, and the program I was involved in was a very intensive, full press, all day and all weekend journalism workshop. And so what I remember about Ann Arbor is working all the time, being a journalist there, running around, learning the city, learning other things, learning the basics of journalism. And I took as my cognate area, we had a cognate area in Eastern European Studies, and I got to work with some of the very fine professors who were there, both in courses and independent studies. So I had a great appreciation for the intellectual depth and breadth of the University of Michigan. Well, my journalism mentor was Charles Eisendrath, who is still there and who runs the Knight Wallace Journalism Fellows today. We're still very good friends and frequently in touch. I did some interesting work on Hungary with a geographer named George Kish, who I believe has passed away. Also, John Fine, who was an expert on Bulgaria. But my primary emphasis at that time was in becoming as competent a journalist as I could in as limited a time. Driven student. I mean, I'd been sort of, I would have preferred to spend my life reading books, but I knew I had to have a profession, and so I was very concentrated and focused on my studies and mastering the craft of journalism. I regret that I didn't have more time. I remember I took graduate courses in Eastern European Studies where I simply didn't have time to do the volume of reading that other students did. Now, you have to remember, this was a time when you went to the library and you read things in journals and in books. There was no internet whatsoever. And I wish I'd had more time. I think that is very frequently, when people are working especially, I think I hear that from my own students, I hear it from other people, I've heard it from a woman who got a doctorate from Harvard. You just simply wish you had more time to be a student. When I was there, I remember I went there as a student. I was 25 years old. I had just gotten married. I had no interest in hanging out and drinking on the Diag. I don't know if I would have anyway, but I was sort of beyond that. I was active in the campus organization of the Society of I was active in the campus organization of the Society for Professional Journalists, which we then called Sigma Delta Chi, and I was a teaching assistant after my first semester all the time I was there. I was a teaching assistant, the primary teaching assistant for the master's program. Also, I think I taught a couple undergraduate classes in journalism, basic news reporting, but I didn't have time for much else other than that, and going out and hanging out at Borders bookstore and buying books if I could afford them. No. I'm trying to think. I don't have any one particular story about my time at the University of Michigan, but it was a very intense, it was a very, very good time. And most of the people I went to school with, it was a very, very good time. Most of the people I was in school with have gone on to very fantastic careers. John Broder, who was a year ahead of me and was my teaching assistant, is now, I believe, the executive editor and maybe the publisher of the International Herald Tribune based in Paris. A lot of other people did some very, very good things, and I certainly owe my success as a journalist in large part to what I learned there. Well, I started out as I did internships and part-time things. I became night police reporter at the Toledo Blade newspaper. It became its national correspondent. Became a roving national and foreign, primarily foreign correspondent for the Detroit News, when it was a very different paper and a different incarnation, for 4 years until Gannett bought it. And I was the editor of a couple of magazines. I was the assistant managing editor of the Commercial Appeal in Memphis, Tennessee. And then I came back to Detroit, and I taught here, and I've had two careers as a freelance journalist primarily, and as a faculty member here. I taught part-time for a semester and was hired full-time, and have been here for 23 years ever since. And I worked for the New York Times. I covered all the Kevorkian trials. I also won a National Emmy Award for my work on a frontline documentary about Kevorkian. I wrote about the assisted suicide issue for most national media, Esquire, Vanity Fair, other things like that. So it's been an interesting and varied career. Bumps, of course, along the way. Things disappear. You quit, you get fired, all that sort of the normal journalist life story. But all in all, it's been a fulfilling career. Oh, yes, I've spoken to the Michigan Journalism Fellows most years. I've spoken to other classes, and I give a lecture every semester in the Ford School of Public Policy. Excuse me. I give a lecture every year at the Ford School for Public Policy. Joe Schwartz, former congressman, always asks me to talk to his classes, graduate and undergraduate, about journalism. And of course, everyone likes to go to Ann Arbor whenever they can. And I occasionally go there in connection with my work at Michigan Radio, although I have broadcasting equipment now in my home. So I'm no stranger to Ann Arbor. I was at the University of Michigan as a graduate student, and about 3 years after the end of the Vietnam War. It was sort of a quiescent time. Jimmy Carter was president, Vietnam was over, Watergate was over. The country was sort of bruised, and people were sort of not in a very political mood. I think you would have had, obviously, there was much more student activism. As an undergraduate, I saw lots of it, got tear gassed, all of that. There was much more a decade before I was there. I was there, remember, from 1977 to 1979, and there was much more a decade later. But it really wasn't a time for activism, or for a whole lot of activism, and I was so busy that I wouldn't have noticed. I talked once, and then, this is sort of a familiar thing for graduate students. I talked once to a friend who was working on his doctorate in history at the time that Joseph Stalin died, and he said he barely noticed it. He barely had time to deal with it because he had to deal with all the material he had to do for his dissertation. So that sometimes happened, but it wasn't a very political period in Ann Arbor in the late 1970s. I think the University of Michigan's role should be. I have no idea whatsoever. I don't think the university is especially engaged with Detroit at all. I think it probably should have done more than it has. I think the university should collaborate with Wayne State University, which has this urban mission, possibly other educational institutions, possibly Michigan State, which is sort of the premier agricultural university. We're talking about urban farming here, to see how they best could help. And I don't mean putting on their white pith hats and coming down here and saying, hi, we're the great civilized white explorers and we're going to tell you how to live. No, but there are certainly ways in which they could put their expertise to use, and I really don't see that happening. Now, to be fair, until fairly recently, the government of Detroit didn't give any indication they wanted that. They sometimes were actively hostile to that. But I think with all the intellectual and other know-how in the main research universities of this state, it would be nice to see them putting things to work more to help Detroit. But it's going to take some thought. It's going to take some planning. And I hope, I may be totally wrong, I hope there are people from the U of M and other schools meeting and talking about how to do this, but if they are, I'm not aware of it. Well, I think the University of Michigan, of course, is the premier university in the state. There are other things that other schools do better, but overall, of course, U of M is the giant elephant in the room. But my concern is that the University of Michigan, and my concern is that the University of Michigan and increasingly other major state universities are just not affordable for working class and even middle class people. If you're the University of Michigan, you need to be a university for Michigan. By the officials of the University of Michigan's own admission, getting an undergraduate degree now costs well over $100,000 if you do it in 4 years. There are a whole lot of people that are never going to be able to come up with that money. There are people who are taking out massive student loans with any understanding really about how they're going to pay them back. So we need in this country to have affordable public higher education for everybody. That doesn't necessarily mean a 4-year degree. You might mean you're going to be a highly skilled plumber or a welder. We need higher education. We need a lot more people with four-year degrees. Unless we have that, we're not, it's sort of a catch-22 chicken and the egg cycle here. we're not retaining people because we don't have jobs for them. We don't have jobs for them because they don't have people with university degrees. If you ask me, what would I like to see the University of Michigan do? I'll tell you. I'd like the University of Michigan to work on the problem that in Detroit you have a lot of people, a large number of people, hundreds of thousands of people probably, who really are not functional. They are not functional in the current economy. They do not have skills. Many of them are functionally illiterate. Many of them have no history of sort of work, no work ethic, no knowledge of the mores of work. And these people are right here. They're not going anywhere. There's all sorts of beautiful books and studies about the future of Detroit, concentrating on gentrification and concentrating on a whole bunch of hipsters moving here and remaking the city. Well, that's nice, and you sort of need that. But what about the people who are existing, who are here now? If I were asked, I'd put them to work in some version of the old WPA from the Depression. I'd have a Works Progress Administration deal so they could be put to work in some place that would give them dignity, give them some money, and help out society. Somebody needs to come up with something for that, and there are lots of people at the University of Michigan, anthropologists, economists, urban experts, sociologists, who know far, far more than I do about all these things. I think maybe the greatest gift the university could render to the state is doing something like that. What advice? Here's the advice I give the future University of Michigan students. Make sure this is the right university for you. If you're a graduate student, probably is. If it has if they specialize in your discipline, you probably won't find a better and more affordable place, certainly outside of the Ivy League. But if I had a criticism of the University of Michigan, it does not do enough to nurture its undergraduates. They treat them sort of like salmon fry. They spawn them into the waters, and some of them make it and some of them don't. 18-year-olds, even very bright 18-year-olds, on their own for the first time, don't always make good decisions, don't always make intellectually good decisions. I would like to see the University of Michigan, we're a long way now from the old concept of in loco parentis, but I would like to see the university reach out more to do more things for these students. They certainly didn't do it in my time. From what I hear from friends who have children there, they're not doing it now.